100 ornithopters in the cube, 100 ornithopters. Put one on my stack, then pass the pack. 99 ornithopters in the cube, 99 ornithopters in the cube, 99 ornithopters. Put one on my stack, then pass the pack. 98 ornithopters in the cube, 98 ornithopters in the cube, 98 ornithopters. Put one on my stack, then pass the pack. 97 ornithopters in the cube, 97 ornithopters in the cube, 97 ornithopters. Put one on my stack, then pass the pack. 96 ornithopters in the cube, 96 ornithopters in the cube, 96 ornithopters. Put one on my stack, then pass the pack. 95 ornithopters in the cube, 95 ornithopters in the cube, 95 ornithopters. Put one on my stack.
Is that a yes?
Yes, I'm ready.
Okay, cool.
Great.
In that case, welcome to another episode of Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy, and I am here, as always, with my co-host, Anthony, my partner in getting this podcast done as quickly as possible so we can go outside and enjoy the perfect weather, Maddox.
Yep, our main thing we're trying to do here is not do this anymore as quickly as possible.
Fast.
Great. It is really nice outside.
It's so nice outside.
I might go back inside and play Magic.
Yeah, I mean, Magic is also nice, but I want
Maybe it's nice enough to play Magic outside.
Oh, it definitely is.
I didn't
think
think about
it definitely
that.
is. So that'll be
okay.
the highlight of the evening. You bring a light jacket, though. You're going to want layers.
Yeah.
You're going to want layers. I want to mention upfront in this episode that we have a playmat for sale. We mentioned at the end of the previous episode, but I know from looking at my analytics that a lot of you turn off episodes when it starts winding down. You're like, I'm sure they're not going to say anything else cool or interesting. I'm just going to turn this one off. So for those of you that did not hear...
You missed out. Sorry.
It's gone. It's sold out.
That's why you should listen till the end.
We have a playmat on sale that is an illustration I did. It's based on a little saying that I wrote for our CubeCon track jackets that just says Cube will outlive magic. And I spent a long time working on both the illustration and also finding a vendor to produce it the way I wanted. It's got embossed gold foil, which was a whole thing to try and work out.
I got one right in front of me now, and it looks great.
I'm really happy with how it turned out.
I mean, you even just did multiple, printings of just trying to tweak the colors a little bit and getting the alignment and the spacing just right.
Yeah, had to pay a not insignificant amount of money per single one-off proof, and did it a couple times before we got happy with it. You actually know from experience, Anthony, I have other playmat designs that I have not been happy enough and refused to sell. So this one has cleared the bar. I'm happy enough with it to put it out there into the world. So go check out luckypaper.co/shop. There's a link there to this pre-order. We're taking pre-orders, so we're going to order a big batch from our vendor once we get as many orders as we're going to get, and it's going to be open until April 17th, and then after April 17th, we'll place that order. The vendor said it'll expect a couple-week turnaround time. I'm going to say plan for more than a month turnaround time because I like to under-promise and over-deliver, and these will ship sometime in early summer once we get them from our vendor and then put them out to you. They're $50, and it's $50 including free shipping anywhere in the world. Yes, this means we're going to take a little bit of a bath, maybe, if you live in Australia or certain parts of Europe.
If you're on a research trip at McMurdo.
If you're in McMurdo Station, I will send you a mat for free. Just, prove it.
I don't know if you should offer that.
I will do it.
I was just reading a book about Antarctic exploration, and they were talking at some point about pricing, like, how much does all of this equipment cost based on what it took to get it here?
If we have a listener in Antarctica, I will send it to you at my full expense. I promise this. Anyway, I really didn't want people that live in Europe or in Central and South America or elsewhere in the world to have to pay a lot more money to get their hands on this playmat just because we happen to be in the United States. I know that happens a lot to people that are not in the United States where a lot of stuff is happening, especially in the Magic world. They have to either pay exorbitant amounts of money to get their hands on the same thing, or they just can't get it at all. So we've chosen to charge a little more for the playmat and hopefully make up any additional shipping charges we incur for you far-flung fans with domestic sales. So that's the plan. Check it out, and we will not plug it again maybe until the last week before the pre-order is going to be closed because plugs are distasteful.
It's true. Let's close up the old plug bag.
Well, before we close up the plug bag, Anthony, there's a couple knock-on effects of getting this playmat produced. One of them is that I'm going to be shipping them all out, and I have to have a return address on all of the shipping labels I produce, and I don't want to give all you freaks my home address for obvious reasons. So because of that, we had to get a P.O. box, but that means Lucky Paper now has a P.O. box. So if you want to send us stuff, we'll probably open it and read it on the show or talk about it on the show if you want us to. Tell us if you don't. You can send it to Lucky Paper, P.O. Box 4855, Baltimore, Maryland, 21211. and that'll get to us. You have the key to the P.O. box right in front of you.
I put it away, actually. I don't.
Oh, you put it away, wherever you have it. I gave it to you.
It's safe.
I gotta say, it felt cool to get a P.O. box. I don't know why.
Tell me about the experience.
I mean, the experience was
You walk
whatever.
in and say, give me a P.O. box, and they say, fill out this form?
Well, I
kinda like
did
that?
it all online. I reserved it, paid for it, filled out the form, so I just went and handed it
Okay.
to them. They had to verify my identity in a couple ways, but that was all whatever.
CAPTCHA, make sure you're not a robot.
Just having a P.O. box feels so old school and cool to me. I can't describe why.
Okay.
Just like the idea that like I go to the mail
Yeah, you're so cool. They don't even bring the mail to you. You go get the mail.
post office. I said mail, and then I was like mail store, mail station. What word is it?
Gotta go to
Post
the mail
office.
store, buy some mail.
I go to the post office. I get to like open a little box, and it's got stuff in there. I don't know. It's just maybe I'll build a relationship with the people that work at the post office. If I get a lot of things, I can go there and
like,
check them
oh
out.
yeah, your fans really had something weird to send you after last episode.
You got that box labeled bees.
No, it's labeled not bees.
I stole that joke from someone in the Discord. Sorry to you. Anyway, P.O. Box, playmat, check them both out. Natural transition to the rest of the episode. We definitely didn't record this at the end.
Put one on my stack, then pass the pack. 61 ornithopters in the cube. 61 ornithopters in the cube. 61 ornithopters. Put one on my stack.
Anthony, we rarely do formal follow-up on prior episodes.
I don't think that's even true.
I think it is.
We've done whole episodes where we're just...
Well, so sometimes we'll like build on an idea, but it's like never the episode right after the previous episode that we're responding to, and it's always like we've taken a couple steps further. A lot of podcasts have a whole segment where what they do is talk about all the feedback they got on the previous episode. We don't ever do that very often.
Okay, I was going to say, like what?
Don't ever do that very often.
And then I thought of a few podcasts that do that, so yes.
Don't ever do that very often is not a thing. We have not really done that. I certainly don't do that as a matter of course, but I feel like the last episode generated enough conversation that it deserves addressing, at least in passing, before we get to our main topic, which, as a teaser... I mean, you're going to see it in the title of the episode. I designed a cube where the only creatures are ornithopters, and there's 100 of them. We'll talk about that later on in this episode, but first, art follow-up.
Art follow-up. I had some follow-up on the art. I feel like a lot of people were a little bit upset by our conversation about art. People felt a little bit marginalized or patronized by the discussion that we had, and I feel a little bit complicated about it, obviously. I mean, this is a podcast that's not super scripted. It's just you and me talking about whatever we want to talk about. And the reality is a lot of people do listen to this podcast now and put a lot of emphasis on the kinds of things that we say. And I feel like what I personally did a bad job of saying very explicitly was the thing I think that we were trying to say at the beginning of the episode is there's this really important difference between art as a value proposition versus the kind of thing we're talking about. And really what we wanted to do when we were setting up like what is art was just separate these ideas and say that very often art is used as a value judgment, and to say something is not art means it is not worthwhile or it is not good. And that's just not what our intention was at all. And by talking about sort of the difference between illustration versus personal artistic expression and the way that, corporate America talks about art and has the art department, like there already is just a weird space that is trying to make a value judgment out of it. And the reality is we can't sit here and say this is what these terms mean, like if you're not using these terms this way it's incorrect, because that's not the way linguistics works. If people are using a word in a way, that's what it means. But we wanted to sort of talk about it and frame that particular conversation so we could move on and talking about creative expression and craft and these other ideas that really needed a very specific definition. And obviously, if somebody is using the words differently, it doesn't mean that they're wrong, because that's not how linguistics works.
Yeah.
Did that make any sense? I feel like now I feel like I had a lot of thoughts and now I'm just rambling.
Yeah, that's the problem. You can't ever think ahead of time when you're recording a podcast, then it all comes out all jumbled.
Or you could do a lot of thinking and like carefully script stuff out.
It doesn't work for me. Maybe it works for you. It doesn't work for me. Yeah, I definitely felt like the biggest thing I feel like was misconstrued was that our defining of some things as not art seemed to be a slight towards them. And to be clear, based on the way we defined art, I defined art, there's a lot of awful art out there that I hate and don't want to engage with. There's a lot of thoughtless art, hateful art, just bad, poorly executed art. We're defining it as a means of self-expression. Some people's self-expression, I'm not interested in it at all. There's a lot of bad self-expression out there. And conversely, there's a lot of good and beautiful things that are made through, that come from a place that is not purely self-expression, right? That are complex, that are compromised in some way, right? I mean, some of my favorite things, like I love Star Trek The Next Generation, right? And that is a TV show that at its core is, yes, a show that Gene Roddenberry wanted to make. It is like his creative endeavor. It exists because he wanted to express his world and it kind of tell a story about how humanity relates to the rest of the world. But then layered on top of that is just myriad compromises to make it fit in like an episodic, network television show, and all the compromises you have to make to be on network TV in the first place, and all the things you can't show on TV, and just all the things that are involved in making such a big production is inherently very compromised. So it's a spectrum, right? Not a binary. It's not like things are either art or not art. It's that there is...
Some things are more about the artistic and creative expressive intent, and some things are more about achieving more practical goals, and whether that's communicating something or creating something that solves a specific problem or demonstrates some information in a certain way, and those are all valid.
Right. I think what we were trying to say in that conversation is that the art and magic over time has moved down that spectrum, I think, from the more expressive to the more practical, fulfilling a goal, fulfilling a need, right? The control that the creative directors and that the world builders have in terms of what the direction they give to artists has gotten tighter. I mean, it went from like literally just asking their friends to like draw a picture of a dragon to like these, rich guides and storyboards and, world building style guides and things. And that has an impact, right? And the impact is that I think a lot of people pointed out there's a lot less really bad art and magic. If you go to look at the old cards, some of them are just god awful, right? They just don't really make any sense of what the card says. They are, in terms of like technical skill, just awful. Like there's a lot of huge misses in early Magic art. And there's also, I think, a lot of huge hits and things that are great in a way that we will probably not get anymore now that Magic is such a big and established game with so much inertia and so much at stake for, doing a weird art thing. So that's, I think, what we were trying to do. And like you said, the only point of defining art that way was really to have that conversation, right?
Right.
If you look up the dictionary definition of art, I'm sure it is in some ways more broad and in some ways more narrow. It's going to say like, oh, if it's a painting, it's art, because that's what people say when they mean art. And the dictionary is descriptive, not prescriptive. What we were trying to argue for is an interpretation of that term that would help shed light on the conversation we wanted to have about the relationship between magic and art and the future and generative images and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And I just get really frustrated when we get hung up on these kind of semantic arguments, because that's not the most important thing. Like, it's really important that we communicate well, but it's not important to defend a specific meaning of a word. If that's not working, then just, find other words to express what is important. Just to share an anecdote, I feel like this sort of idea of like separating the codification of is something art or not with is something valuable or not is sort of the opposite angle, where at some point in art school, literally somebody in one of my sculpture classes just leaned a 2x4 against the wall and was like, this is my piece. And we proceed to have a much too lengthy conversation about this art piece. And it's like, okay, I actually don't care whether this is art or not. I think this is not valuable. I think this is not a good thing and it's not worth our time. And whether or not it's art is not the important question to be asking here. And I feel like that just cuts both ways. A lot of things are art that are not valuable to me personally. And a lot of things in this particular definition I wouldn't describe as art that are extremely valuable. So
yeah, we were both in a class where one person's art, by their own description, was when asked to present their piece, they simply walked over to the window in the classroom, opened it, and started smoking a cigarette out of it. And that was their art piece. And the professor was like, excuse me, what are you doing? And the person just continued smoking their cigarette. Argue in the comments about whether or not that qualifies as art, because I think a lot of times in art school, you're in this context where everything is presumed art, right? And because of that, everything is given the validation of presumed creative expressive intent. And sometimes you just slack off and do a bad job of the project. I mean, I'm guilty of that. I'm sure maybe you never slacked off in art school and barely did a project, but I had a dumb assignment for some class I didn't like where I literally just dragged some canvases around on the streets of Baltimore and let them get marked up however they got marked up and then put them on the wall because I was like, wow. I just don't care.
You know what? Not only is that art, that's drawing.
It was for a drawing class, actually. Yeah, we should really be having the what's drawing discussion now. That is where this gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Anyway, you said that there was a lot of people that were frustrated, annoyed, maybe even like offended at our previous conversation. I want to emphasize that my overall impression from the feedback we've gotten is that it was overwhelmingly positive, not in the sense that people were like, you did a great job and like, clapping for us, but in the sense that there was thousands and thousands of messages sent in the content discussion channel of the Cube Talk Discord, and 95+% of them were amazing, like enlightening, very thoughtful people approaching this subject in a myriad ways from different perspectives and sharing with each other in like an honest and vulnerable way and respecting each other in the conversation. So I actually think that I'm really happy with the response to the episode, more broadly speaking. I do think that, yeah, a lot of things were misconstrued by certain people because it's hard to talk into microphones for an hour and not say something that can be perceived the wrong way. And, we have to own the degree to which our words created that confusion. But overall, I think that the conversation that resulted from that episode was fantastic. And for those of you that are not in the Cube Talk Discord, go check it out and look back a week and go to the content discussion channel. And you've got, a short novel of really interesting conversation to read up on, I think.
Or maybe a long novel. There's a lot of messages.
There's a lot of messages. It sure was.
Maybe we should also just clarify, this is not the Lucky Paper Discord, but this is the place that you and I are both pretty active. It's just a big public Magic Discord. You and I have been members for a long time before we even started this podcast.
Yeah, and to be clear, we don't have a Discord, nor do we want to start a Discord. I don't want to be in charge of moderating anything, so...
And it's like, to me personally, I totally understand and respect why a lot of creative outlets have their own dedicated channels for communication. It's also just really fun for us to be part of a bigger community. But yeah, if maybe we are not super responsive in emails or in other social media, this is maybe the place where we are easiest to get a hold of anyway. So check it out. It's a fun place to talk about Cube.
Yeah. I want to address one other thing from our conversation, which I think is a really important thing. This is something that was brought up in the Discord by Spice Like Empress, who is currently apparently going by Spice Torch Snow Stab.
There's some inside jokes in the Discord.
The display names are changing regularly, but
it's worth it.
They brought up something which wasn't something I was really consciously aware of, which is that I thought the vast majority and or all of the negative reaction to this piece from the Magic world more broadly was just people that didn't like it aesthetically. That were just like...
Specifically, we're talking about the Carly Mazur Faithless Looting illustration, correct?
Right. What are you doing over there?
Sadie has stolen my microphone, my headphones.
Sadie, you're tangled in the headphones. And, I should have known, Anthony, because I think a lot of times what people portray as aesthetic preferences, or even think themselves... Sadie, it's fine. Or even themselves think are their own aesthetic preferences, are actually... kind of a dog whistle or a sign of something else. And it turns out that a fair bit of the negative response to this Carly Mazur piece, some of it very explicitly, is just transphobic and anti-queer and awful. Basically, the depiction of the character in this art reads as androgynous or potentially masculine, but is wearing a sort of dress shape thing. And a lot of people's response to that was awful and bigoted and terrible. And that's something that we should not overlook when talking about the negative response to that piece, because it is part of why people, I think, at least some people, had a negative response to it. Not everybody, obviously. Some people probably just actually don't like how it looks, but I think there's a lot of people for whom, like, there's actually... Have you ever looked at the About page on Carly Mazur's website?
It's been a long time.
It includes a bunch of screenshots of what I think are 4chan, where somebody refers to the piece as Wizards of the Coast trying to destroy Western culture. It's... I appreciate...
That's pretty face up.
I appreciate that Carly has a sense of humor about it, but it's not funny, and it sucks. So that's something I don't want to gloss over. I mean, I think queer imagery seems to be something that is woven throughout all of Carly's work, and so it's not a reach to assume that that's some part of what's being expressed here, whether implicitly or explicitly. And yeah, for people that don't like it for that reason, you stop listening to our podcast. You're banned from listening to the podcast.
Yeah, I mean, it's not totally surprising that these fit on a spectrum of just like people reacting to, this doesn't look like what I expect and am comfortable with, and that can be anything
that
from the
could
purely
be a lot of
like,
reasons.
aesthetic and formal to the slightly more terrible.
Xenophobic. Yeah, it could be a lot of reasons. So I want to make sure we also just covered that, because that seems like a really important thing that we didn't bring up in the previous episode. And also, I mean, it's worth noting, as of the recording of this episode, which I'm going to timestamp this one too, Wednesday, March 20th, 4:58 p.m., Sam's video still hasn't come out. I thought for sure it was going to come out before our episode, but I guess he was teasing that video for the far future. So we're still waiting to hear Sam weigh in.
Maybe we spooked him away from it. He's like, they already said it all.
I really doubt it. I highly, highly doubt it. Hopefully he covers that specific issue of queer imagery and queer-coded imagery and people's response to it in his video. I suspect he will.
ornithopters, put one on my stack, then pass the pack. 44 ornithopters in the cube, 44 ornithopters in the cube, 44 ornithopters, put one on.
Here's a little story about how this cube came to be. I was on Twitter, as I'm wont to be sometimes, and Pleasant Kenobi, aka Vince, tweeted out, "If you really want to cultivate a play experience that achieves aesthetic, mechanic, or nostalgic goals, you should really consider building a cube to play. It's one of the best ways to pick up what you like about Magic most and share that with other people." This was right around CubeCon, so I think Vince was on the high of CubeCon and just feeling the love for the format and put out this tweet. Vince, obviously, a big personality on Twitter with lots of followers, and so I was just looking at this tweet and saw a response to it from a person I don't follow, who doesn't follow the show, as far as I know, has no idea what Lucky Paper is, who responded and asked, "Is there a resource you recommend if I could learn how to construct my own cube?" Then they said, "Can my cube be all ornithopters?" And I was in a mood this day, Anthony. And the mood was, when I read this tweet, I desperately wanted to prove to this person that this thing, which I assume was mentioned as a joke, my read of this tweet is, can my cube literally be 360 ornithopters? Which, yes, it can, obviously. But more than that, I wanted to express that not only can you do that as a joke, haha, isn't that funny, you could also make a really interesting cube from the restriction of, quote, all ornithopters. And I proceeded to design a list. This is from October of last year, and it looks like, 2 days later, I posted a list that I had put together, the first draft of a cube I'm calling 100 Ornithopters.
You're really locking yourself in there. That doesn't give you a lot of flexibility.
It was a nice round number. The first decision I made is I didn't want to have any special rules. I didn't want to have Ornithopters in the land bin. I just wanted to have Ornithopters in the cube. I thought that would be a much more powerful way to express the idea. You open up a pack that's half full of Ornithopters. It's kind of a funny aesthetic thing. And I wasn't thinking hard about it. So I said 100 Ornithopters, nice round number. That's roughly-ish the amount of creatures I think you would include in a normal-ish cube, or at least on the same order of magnitude, maybe a few fewer than you include in most cubes.
It's in the spectrum.
Yeah, a third creatures feels about right.
The bottom of the thick part of the bell curve.
So I just picked 100 because it was a round number and started trawling through Scryfall and made a list and posted it for this person because I was in this mood. And also I thought it was funny,
the mood to make a point on Twitter.
Well, I also think it's funny. I was trying to be inspired by this tweet. I wanted to make this person laugh because they had done an offhanded joke in an offhanded tweet. And then a couple days later, a random stranger's like, "Hey, I've spent a couple hours building this thing you talked about. And actually, I think it's kind of cool and not just stupid."
Great idea. I finished it for you.
So R. Morgan Slade, if you're out there and you are listening to this episode, thanks for the tweet. And I hope my cube design was received in good humor. Based on your replies, I think it was.
Hope to see you at CubeCon next year, where you can probably play 100 Ornithopters.
Well, let's talk about that, Anthony, because that was the end of my interaction with the 100 Ornithopters Cube. I spent a few hours going through Scryfall and thinking, this is fun and novel. There's some fun things to play with here. The restriction I ended up holding myself to, I should say, is that my interpretation of all ornithopters was that the only creatures that can ever be in play must be the card ornithopter.
Oh, interesting. So I actually didn't notice this on my first read. There isn't anything that even makes tokens.
There's no tokens. There are no creature lands. There are no vehicles. There is no way to have a creature in play that is not an ornithopter card.
Not even an Ornithopter of Paradise?
There might be a treasure token or two. There are no creature tokens. And no, there's no Ornithopter of Paradise. It all has to be the literal card ornithopter. That was my interpretation of the restriction just because it seemed the most whimsical to me, right? And also I felt like because Ornithopter is on its face not the most powerful card, though we're going to get into that because I think there's some interesting things that came up when designing this cube. I thought if I had creature lands or, creature tokens, it might become very easy for the Ornithopters to not matter. And the easiest way to make sure the Ornithopters matter is to have all the creatures must be the Ornithopter card. That seems like a very easy way to lock in and commit to that bit. But anyway, that was the end of my dalliance with the 100 Ornithopters Cube. I was done with it. I did my little fun project, whatever. Moving on. Then, unbeknownst to me, some people, including Chill MTG and I think Matt Belcher, M. Belcher is their name, have been organizing a community draft every week over on the CubeCon Discord, which is open to the public. You don't have to be a paid CubeCon attendee to use that Discord. So if you're interested in joining up with these community drafts, you can hop over there, and they do them every Wednesday night. And they've been doing a bunch of cubes from CubeCon, from around the community, and apparently somebody had suggested doing this 100 Ornithopters Cube. I'm not even sure where they saw it. Maybe they follow me on Cube Cobra.
Probably on, I would guess.
Well, but I did
or maybe on Twitter.
I mean, But I only posted it in replies. I never like shared this more broadly. I don't think I did, at least. I just posted it in reply to this guy on Twitter. Maybe I mentioned it in the Cube Talk Discord once in passing, but like I was not putting this thing out there because I didn't spend a lot of time on it. Anyway, unbeknownst to me, they decided they were going to draft this cube, and I was heartbroken. I discovered like a day before they were going to draft it, and I happened to be just out and about. I couldn't watch or stream any of the draft. I just had to like see the results once it were done. But I was really curious to hear how this went. And overall, the response from people was fairly positive. They thought it was a cool cube, they had a fun time, and are interested in exploring it some more. And the fact that they went and drafted it made me like double down. They also recommended some great cards, either to add and cut. And so it also made me kind of go through a second or third time and like make another big batch of changes. So now the cube has been iterated on a couple of times, and this was last week that I was working on this for this draft, and so it's fresh on my mind, and I thought it'd be interesting to talk about.
Is this a new low that the two of us are here talking about a cube neither of us have played?
I'm not sure. Aside from Pack One Pick Ones, which we spend 5-ish minutes on, yeah, I don't think we've done that before. So yeah, maybe a new low.
So it's gonna get theoretical.
We're playing in the theoretical space. I have a couple ideas of where to start, but first I want to ask, do you have any questions looking at this list, Anthony? Or like immediate comments or
all right,
anything enlightening to share with our lovely listeners?
Here was my first thought is, you didn't put, as far as I can tell, like a bunch of other combos of just like alternate ways to win the game, right? Like you're gonna win.
There are a bunch of combos, but they all include Ornithopters.
Yeah, so it's like Ornithopters are the thing. We're not really going to cheat out of that. So my first thought was, well, the obvious thing is we're going to have to make those Ornithopters bigger. They only cost 0, but they have 0 power. So we're going to need some +1/+1 counters, some equipment, all kinds of auras just to make these things into actual threats. So does this cube just turn into you're just drafting equipment and enchantments, and you better hope you also draw enough Ornithopters to make those things that are actually your threats work? As I started looking more at the list you put together, there's definitely just a lot of other sort of things that Ornithopters do here. Like, it seems like there's a little bit of a storm thing. There's cards like Paradoxical Outcome that let you turn all your free spells into a bunch of card draw. There's other things that just care about casting a creature a bunch. In green you have Glimpse of Nature or go wide strategies with stuff like Beastmaster Ascension or Curse of Predation. So it does seem like you're trying to make a bunch of different things happen within this restriction of all your creatures are Ornithopters, and it's not necessarily just give it pants and see who can make the bigger Thopter.
Right. And this is what actually made me sink my teeth into this a little further, was realizing that I think this cube, on a spectrum from like the Bun Magic Cube or regular cube to like our much more experimental out there projects like the Degenerate Micro Cube and the Turbo Cube, both of which have significant rules modifications that have changed how the game works. Having test drafted this a couple times, looked at the decks that were actually played in the human draft, I think this is actually kind of like somewhere in the middle of that spectrum, maybe further to like the degenerate, like experimental end than you might expect. And it's really interesting to get there through nothing but card choice, right? And as soon as you have a cube that has 100 0-mana artifacts in it, forget that they are Ornithopters for a second, just 100 0-mana artifacts, some cards just become really, really strong, and you end up being able to make these really strange, powerful decks that also don't resemble any combo decks in Constructed, because you can only have 4 Ornithopters in Constructed, but here, the player that had the most in the draft that actually happened with humans had 19 Ornithopters in their deck.
That's a lot of... So what were there 4 to 5 other cards?
Well, let me tell you about this deck. So this deck was 19 Ornithopters. It was a dedicated combo deck that used Symbiotic Deployment, which I'll read a couple of these rules text things, but this is going to be one of the episodes. You're really going to want to look at the cards mentioned page. For those that don't know, we have a page on our website for every episode where we show a visual spoiler of all the cards we mention in chronological order, and you're going to want to look at that page for this one, but I'll hit you with Symbiotic Deployment. This is 2 and a green for an enchantment that says skip your draw step. It has an activated ability, pay 1, tap 2 untap creatures you control to draw a card. So Symbiotic Deployment in combination with Intruder Alarm, which untaps all your creatures every time you play another creature, and a big mana-producing card like Gaia's Cradle.
Yeah, I'm glad you finally found a way to make Gaia's Cradle really powerful with a bunch of free creatures.
I mean, Gaia's Cradle's really good in this cube, as is Tellurian Academy, and they do...
Yeah, they're the same card.
Pretty much exactly the same thing, but in different colors. There are other non-Ornithopter artifacts, so Academy is a little better, but that basically allows you to just kind of draw your whole deck, and this was just a Storm deck that won with Aetherflux Reservoir, and so the player that was playing this deck was mulliganing very hard to Crop Rotation or Mystical Tutor, so they could look at their Gaia's Cradle, and then just trying to find their other combo pieces. And the deck, as far as I could tell, was really interesting and worked really well sometimes, fizzled some other times. It's kind of a glass cannon style deck, but the fact that a deck like this is draftable, where 19 of your cards are Ornithopter, playing 13 lands, and then, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 non-Ornithopter, non-land cards, is just a kind of cool thing you can do. Chill MTG happened to mention that he felt that drafting it was kind of similar to like a Desert Cube, where you have to draft your lands. Here you don't have to draft your lands.
You need the resources. You need the Ornithopter to make your other cards work.
Right, and that's fundamental decision in a Desert Cube draft where you're looking at a pack and you're like, am I supposed to take planes here, or am I supposed to take this like very good pushed like, A- card in my archetype? And you have to actually make that decision. I think it comes up here too. Like the point at which you take Ornithopters in the draft is a really interesting question, and that was my biggest question for the players that actually drafted this cube, because again, I picked 100 because it was a nice round number, but it sounded like they were actually reasonably fought over in the draft. Like people weren't getting the last 4 picks of every pack were all Ornithopter, and they could get them for free because, some players like this one were mopping them all up. They got 19 of them. So yeah, I think there's actually a pretty wide range of decks that are possible here, and the fact that some of these decks I think are very powerful, like if you just shuffled them up and put them up against the Bun Magic Cube deck, would legitimately have a chance, even though the context is totally different, and you would think putting 100 Ornithopters in a cube is a fast track to making it a really slow, not that powerful, awful cube. It's not the case at all. Right? You can just do so much with these 0-mana artifacts and 0-mana creatures to make them really potent in interesting ways. And that radical context shift that came not from a rules modification, but purely from card choice is what had me interested in actually pursuing this cube a little further.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny how in something like your Degenerate Microcube, you make people care about the interaction between a very small number of cards, and it seems like this is doing something different, not by totally eliminating those cards, but just filling up that space with redundant pieces.
Yeah, so you're going to have Ornithopters, your opponent's going to have Ornithopters, and you get to then figure out the density of them you want to have, and what your strategy is going to be. And the one you mentioned, I think, is definitely a strategy, which is I do have a bunch of auras in here, I have a fair number of equipment in here, and that's, like, to me, the, like, fair deck. You're going to play Ornithopters, but not that many of them.
Level 1 strategy.
Maybe you're going to play 10 or 9 or whatever, enough that you can draw a few over the course of a game, and you're going to put some pants on them and attack. And as best as I can tell, this was a perfectly fine strategy. The person that ended up winning the whole draft, going 3-0, did in fact have Ethereal Armor, Hyena Umbra, Colossus Hammer, Stoneforge Masterwork, Ancestral Mask, all in their main deck. So they were kind of doing a version of this. Now, they got to include some of the really broken stuff that you get because all the creatures are Ornithopters, which I want to dive into that next because I think some of the other decks are really interesting.
Thrumming Stone?
This is a cube for Thrumming Stone. For those that don't know, Thrumming Stone gives all of your cards Ripple 4. And if you don't,
what is Ripple?
If you don't know what Ripple 4 is, then you're normal. You're a normal Magic player because...
Or just a normal person who's never played Magic before.
This is a perfect example of a mechanic, though, that doesn't work in EDH. I mean, maybe there's some of those decks that play the multiple rats or whatever. But
the persistent... those guys.
For the most part, this mechanic is not going to show up in Commander, which is the most popular casual format. I don't know if it was ever a constructed player. It certainly hasn't been an eternal constructed player. This is a mechanic that says, let me just read Thrumming Stone. That's the best way to do this. Spells you control of Ripple 4. So every spell you control has Ripple 4. Ripple 4, whenever you play a spell, you may reveal the top 4 cards of your library. You may play any revealed cards with the same name as the spell without paying their mana costs. Put the rest on the bottom of your library. You can imagine, obviously, in a 19 Ornithopter deck, this just says... cast 1 Ornithopter, and then you will automatically cast all of the Ornithopters remaining in your deck.
Right, because it counts as casting, so this re-triggers itself,
re-triggers itself, so you just keep going.
It thrums.
Which is obviously ridiculously powerful. The other thing you get access to are some ridiculously powerful answers, like Engineered Explosive, Meltdown, Maelstrom Pulse, Echoing Ruin. These are all cards for, 1 or 2 mana. Pulse is 3 mana. But, cards that are just really effective board wipes that just blow up the entire board because every single creature is a 0-mana creature with the same name. There's a couple I had to exclude that just basically exiled all Ornithopters from your opponent's hand and library and graveyard and just got rid of them all completely that are just way too good here. But you get a lot of really potent answers. But then also, to counter that...
just like Cabal Therapy and things like that.
I think Cabal Therapy would be totally messed up because... you get to name Ornithopter. You name Ornithopter on the first cast, which is already very good. You get a couple Ornithopters.
Right, that's a good point.
Then you get a free flashback almost certainly because you probably have an Ornithopter in hand, so you get to take their next best non-Ornithopter card. I've excluded that because I think it's too good. But so anyway, there's a lot of really efficient answers, but then to pair with all those really efficient answers are really, really efficient ways to recur those threats. So some of the more obvious ones are like Yawgmoth's Will. They all cost 0 mana, so you just get them all back. They just all come back, plus any other spells you want to cast. Then I found the one that's actually, I think, the most powerful of all of them, which is just Echoing Return. Black, return all creatures of a given name from your graveyard to your hand, and they all cost 0, so you just cast them all again.
Did you just search Scryfall for cards that have Echo in the card name?
I should have, but instead I just searched for, some regex that had same name in it, basically. But that card is just 1 mana, return all Ornithopters to your hand, and you get to all the cast triggers again, you get all the ETBs again, and you get your entire board back. So if they manage to melt down you or Echoing Ruin you, you can just Echoing Return them back. And there's like 6 or 7 other cards in this cube.
And I Echoing Counter that, and I Echoing Storm that, and...
Well, yeah, there's like 6 or 7 other cards in this cube that also get back your entire graveyard, basically. And so there's these huge swings of like really efficient answers and really efficient recursion. I think one of my favorite decks, I say having never drafted the cube and played a game with the cube, but one of the decks I like the most in theory is the like Hurkyl's Recall Impact Tremors deck. There's like 4 or 5 ways, maybe even more, to bounce all Ornithopters, either you control or everyone controls, to your owner's hands. And then you play cards like Impact Tremors, or even like Ghirapur Aether Grid, which lets you tap 2 untapped artifacts to deal damage to something. They can be summoning sick, it's fine, because it's just an activated ability of another card. And then you just bounce them all back to your hand, replay them all again, do it all over again, and just, basically combo your opponent to death whatever attacking. And then you mentioned some of the cards that are just really good at making your Ornithopters attack, like Beastmaster Ascension. It's not terribly hard to imagine on turn 3 attacking with 5 Ornithopters, and now they're all 5/7s. Like, it's just... It can go really, really fast that these things get out of hand because all the creatures cost 0 mana.
Yeah, I mean, some of these cards are also interesting in that they give you some value even if you do get your board wipe. Beastmaster Ascension, you build towards that Ascension, and then you still, if your opponent can deal with all your Ornithopters, your next ones will be big too, so don't worry about it.
So those are 2 kinds of decks.
We even have a couple Doran the Siege Tower on a Knot Stick, which doesn't break the creature rule, which is cool.
Right. High Alert and
Huatli
Assault Formation and Huatli are all things that essentially turn your Ornithopters into 2/2s because they deal damage equal to their toughness, which is really good against your opponent's Ornithopters because they can no longer profitably block. It's actually interesting. I started with a lot of regular Anthem effects, and I was like, well, the first Anthem effect
does nothing.
I mean, it means you can get 1 or 2 damage in if you have more Ornithopters than them a turn, but it really kind of effectively does nothing.
Play removal and kill your opponent's Ornithopters so you can attack, maybe.
Sure, maybe. So anyway, those are 2 extremes of the decks. There's like the really fair, I'm just going to play a couple Ornithopters, suit them up with equipment and auras and attack you, and there's I think a lot of actually pretty dedicated degenerate combo decks. I mentioned the one example with Intruder Alarm, but this cube has Earthcraft in it. It has Mystic Forge and Vanquisher's Banner. I found some really interesting combo cards that I'd never heard of before, like Tangle Root. This is just 3 generic mana for an artifact that whenever a player plays a creature spell, that player adds green to their mana pool. It's symmetrical, so, watch out, but if you're playing a deck that can immediately use that mana with like Symbiotic Deployment, for example, to just draw more cards, draw more Ornithopters, then you can probably break the symmetry on that. So there's, I think, some really kind of powerful and degenerate combo decks in this environment as well. I think the last sort of category of decks that at least I can like wrap my head around at this point are decks that are somewhere in between, right? They maybe have some really powerful, like, synergistic payoffs. I'm thinking stuff like some of the best Anthem effects, like Forsaken Monument, for example, is 5 generic mana to give all your colorless creatures +2/+2, and whenever you tap a permanent for colorless mana, you get another colorless mana, and whenever you cast a colorless spell, you gain 2 life. That's kind of messed up. Obelisk of Erd is a +2/+2 Anthem that has Convoke. There's a couple of these other just like really powerful like top-end cards that will turn your Ornithopters into an army on their own without having to play maybe the more risky or committal like auras and equipment. And I think those decks can afford to play like a combination of answers and reactive things and these like synergistic high mana value pieces to make a sort of mid-rangey game plan come together. I'm not exactly sure how his cube plays, but there's definitely clearly a range of what the decks can do, which is kind of exciting to me as a sort of starting point.
You mentioned there's no creature lands, but there are some lands that have effects that buff creatures, which is kind of a funny twist on that.
Yes, yeah, and that I'm not sure how good any of those are. I have a couple of...
The one that gives a creature double strike on its surface maybe doesn't do a lot on its own.
Yeah, well, the thing is, I included, Cradle and Academy, and then because of that, I put in a bunch of ways to tutor lands, like Crop Rotation, Expedition Map. So I figured a bigger package of, like, utility lands might be useful. Some of them I think are pretty good. Like, I think Novagen Heart of Progress is maybe interesting. That land lets you pay 2 mana and tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature that enter the battlefield this turn, which is, again, with a bunch of 0 mana creatures, potentially a lot of creatures. But again, it's only the +1/+1 buff, so the lands thing is definitely a slower strategy that is much more safe and reliable, and I'm not sure if that's actually proven to be viable yet. I'm a little suspect of them, but they are there.
I think the last thing that I notice is you have things like Sphere of Resistance and Damping Sphere. So there's an anti-storm. Is that just to reinforce some of the more fair decks, or is that a dedicated strategy on its own?
My theory there is that I want to give some way for the fair decks to not just lose to their opponent having the, degenerate combo. And the first thing I did was add Rule of Law effects. And there's actually only 2 that are not attached to creatures, which is Rule of Law itself and... Rule of Law is the color-shifted one. I think the original one is Arcane Laboratory, the blue one, but then they realized that's actually more of a white thing, and they gave it to white. That just says players can only cast 1 spell a turn, which, if your plan is to play a couple Ornithopters and put Angelic Destiny on one of them, you're not really paying a huge cost for doing that because you're just making your stuff big and, attacking, turn over turn. But the combo decks just fall apart if they can't deal with a card like Arcane Laboratory or Rule of Law. So you get to, hopefully, make that asymmetrical just by punishing people for trying to cast a bunch of spells in one turn.
You mentioned something else that I was curious about. When you're digging for a bunch of these effects, did you discover that a lot more things are just attached to creatures now than they used to be?
I absolutely did.
Maybe fewer cards to work with than you expected.
I don't want to admit how many cards I was like, oh, it's perfect for the cube, and I put it in, and then only realized a day later, that's a creature. I can't have that in here because it's not an Ornithopter. Yeah, it's actually funny. There's some effects which we've never gotten on non-creatures, which I guess makes sense, but you take that for granted when you're used to using all of the card pool. It was a pretty strict limitation to hold myself to just Ornithopters as the only potential creatures. So that's what I'm happy with. I want to play this cube, but I don't have it in paper, so...
It's going to be difficult to get that many Ornithopters.
I'm going to try and maybe organize a draft on some Discord server where we can play remotely. I just want to play this once or twice and feel if it's worth putting this together and proxying the cards I don't have, because I think it maybe has potential, but there are definitely some things I'm actively not happy with at the start, and I want to talk about those too. Maybe you have some ideas for how I can improve them. Maybe the listeners do. The first thing is the mana fixing, because I frankly have given it very little thought. I just put in my sort of baseline double fetch, triple shock. I augmented that with some of the obvious stuff, like there's a lot of cards that get a lot better here that are mana fixing. There's a bunch of lands that are basically functionally identical but have been reprinted with different names. Survivor's Encampment is one example where they tap for a colorless, or you can tap them and tap an untapped creature you control to add a mana of any color. Ornithopters obviously provide you reliable access to creatures, but more importantly, access to creatures on turn 1 in addition to being able to use your land for mana. So I think those are a lot better here. Same with cards like Spire of Industry. That gets a lot better because you can consistently have an artifact to tap that for any color of mana as well. So aside from throwing in a couple ones that seemed obvious to me, I just basically dropped in my default suite of fixing, and that was one of the pieces of feedback I got from players who drafted it the first time. I think a couple people were like, this just doesn't feel necessary. We've talked about how I really like the fetch shock mana base because it makes you think about it, and I think they were kind of saying, in a cube like this where I have all this other stuff going on, I don't want to also have to be managing my mana in a really complex way.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Focus on the thing that is the log line and don't necessarily overburden it with this, thing that is fun when that's what the cube is about.
Yeah, and there are other huge costs to playing this mana base too, right? Shuffling is very annoying if you play it in paper, and also, if I do want to build this in paper, I don't want to have to get 20 more fetch lands and 30 more shotguns. I just don't want to have to do it. So I'm going to, I think, revise that, but I don't know where to go. Another person, I think it was actually Chill himself, mentioned that even though all the creatures cost 0 mana, the way the game's played out is that nobody was deploying a threat until turn 3 or later, because there's no reason to if you have no reason to have a creature in play on earlier turns of the game, which is actually another thing I would kind of like to address. I want to give people more reasons to play an Ornithopter early. Right now, I think the best things to augment them don't really start until turn 3, but if I could have more things on turn 2 or whatever, that would make it worth playing an early Ornithopter so you could just start getting in and attacking. That might be a good thing to change overall. But if we are going to be a slower format where actually the first couple turns are kind of just waiting, tap lands are much more justifiable, obviously. Mm-hmm. And then the question becomes, if we're excluding any lands that make tokens, any lands that can possibly turn into creatures, where do we go to add interest to the mana fixing, or what mana fixing is appropriate here? And I don't know.
Guild gates. Everyone loves a guild gate.
Nah, not me.
Tower of the Magistrate. I'm just looking at lands that reference Thopters or artifacts. That would be pretty messed up.
It would, but being able to only do it to one thing, make one... I think it's actually kind of interesting. I forgot about Tower of the Magistrate. I'm not sure how messed up that is.
It's like fog forever, or your opponents can never use equipment.
Well, you can't make yourself protection from colorless.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, but you have an Ornithopter, you can...
So one Ornithopter can block one other Ornithopter.
Yes.
So it's not fog forever.
That's good enough for me.
People are going wide here, mostly.
Okay, that's actually good to know. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing that in terms of like two-color lands that really, really screams something that's thematic here.
My first thought was the bridges, because they're also artifacts,
yeah.
And there's a fair number of artifacts matter things going on account of there being 100 Ornithopters.
Yeah, I mean, there's like balance questions about like how much do you actually need more artifacts to make the things that you want to work, but it definitely, if I saw the bridges, I would be like, oh yeah, that feels thematic.
It feels like it kind of fits. Even if it almost never comes up that they're actually artifacts, it does just thematically fit.
Yeah.
The thing that kept me from adding those is I'm between adding either an Ensoul artifact package with the only cards I can think of are Black Staff of Waterdeep, Ensoul Artifact itself, and Tezzeret's Touch.
Yeah,
all of these cards
it might open up this other space where it's like, I'm actually playing the lands deck, which also might be fine.
Well, I don't want you to get beaten down with an indestructible bridge that's been turned into a 5/5.
Yeah.
I already kind of don't like that with Ensoul Artifact. You might get beaten down by a non-Ornithopter. Now, probably not, because you're probably going to have an Ornithopter, and all your other cards that are in your deck that are not Ornithopters have more value to you than just being an Ornithopter.
I've beaten somebody with a skull clamp. It happens. These things happen.
I don't even think it would be strategically correct, but just the idea that it will be possible then to kill your opponent with something other than an Ornithopter really makes me sad. And so I've avoided putting it in for that reason, and I definitely would not put in any Ensoul Artifact effects if I also included the bridges, because the idea of having an indestructible creature is not the idea of this cube. This cube's all about the Ornithopters. So the bridges were a first thought. I think the Surveil lands are some of the most appealing tapped dual lands these days. I think they just, being able to mill something over. There's things in this cube that care about the graveyard. Seems reasonable. Beyond that, I guess like sack lands, because eventually you don't really need mana beyond a certain point, and so I could include some of the lands that you can then sacrifice, like the Horizon lands or otherwise, that just kind of grease the wheels. But yeah, I don't know what the fixing should look like, and it's hard to come up with other things that are like thematic with what's going on.
Maybe a bigger issue with the bridges are effects that bounce all artifacts. That could feel
it is a downside,
pretty rough.
And there are quite a few of those.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I looked. I think I did. I'm not sure if there's anything within a reasonable mana cost that exiles all artifacts. There are things at like 6 mana that exile artifacts, but I don't think there was actually anything in the like Echoing Ruin, Hurkyl's Recall, cards that are novelly broken because of the context of this cube.
Yeah, I'm more thinking about cards like Rebuild that just bounce all artifacts, and your opponent's using it as part of their combo,
exactly.
But incidentally they just Stone Rained you 3 times, and it's like, oh well, I didn't see that coming.
Yeah, if you're playing 3 of them, that could be pretty bad. So yeah, for those reasons, I'm not actually that drawn to them. So I don't know. Comment below if you have an idea for what the mana fixing should look like here.
I mean, you said you don't want to win except by Ornithopters. Does it bother you that Aetherflux Reservoir can just kill people in other ways? I guess it's...
I thought about that, but in this cube, like, you would have to be doing it by casting Ornithopters. There's a couple other ways to win the game here that are not directly Ornithopters, like Grinding Station is in here, which, again, like Aetherflux Reservoir, you're probably just using Ornithopters to fuel it, right?
And you've deliberately, I guess, not included stuff like the Chromatic Sphere and Chromatic Star and Urza's Bauble. Like, you want those to be the little dinky things that are fueling these kinds of machines.
Yeah, I'm not even sure, like, there wouldn't really be any novel synergy with those things. Again, there's a little bit of, like, Metalcraft going on, but I don't see the appeal as much there as just having all the Ornithopters to do that stuff. And to be fair, I'm on the fence about that. If it turned out that Grinding Station and Aetherflux Reservoir were 2 of the best win conditions in the cube, I would definitely just cut them to make it more about Ornithopters, because I don't want it to be so much about these potentially kind of alternate win conditions that definitely hinge on Ornithopters, but don't definitionally mean you're dying to an Ornithopter. Another big issue I have with this cube right now is trying to figure out what the interaction looks like to give people enough answers to some of the big payoff cards, like the Forsaken Monument I mentioned, or Thrumming Stone, or Vanquisher's Banner, these cards that can really totally change the tide of a game, but not also incidentally allow for like a bunch of free-rolled answers to individual Ornithopters. Because in the history of Magic, well, first of all, a lot of those payoffs are artifacts. And so if a thing destroys artifacts, it's also going to be able to incidentally destroy any single Ornithopter, which I don't love the idea of you putting a bunch of answers. It's like it'd be kind of like if, every disenchant in a cube could also incidentally murder any creature, right?
It would just be murder most of the time.
Yeah, but here it's hard to describe this distinction. I don't want the decks that are like, for example, putting auras on their Ornithopters, where they're kind of combining a bunch of smaller, dinkier cards to like make a Voltron of like a big, powerful threat. I don't want them to just incidentally get blown out by the card disenchant that their opponent put in their deck because they wanted to have an answer to Forsaken Monument or to Bulbous Citadel or to Mystic Forge or whatever. But first of all, there are very few cards that destroy only enchantments and not artifacts that are not creatures. There's not that many of them, and most of them are not costed in a way that makes sense. And also, a lot of the payoffs just are artifacts. So a big challenge, and I should say, there's basically no cards that destroy explicitly non-creature artifacts. There's like Gorilla Shaman, which is a creature. That was one of them I put in the cube. It was one of the ones I put in the cube and then was like, it's a creature. I can't include it. What I really want are cards that destroy non-creature artifacts, and I can't quite figure out how to make that work. So right now, I think the interaction is light. There's a fair number of those really big swingy ones I mentioned. A lot of them are symmetrical that either bounce or destroy all the Ornithopters in play. And I've included a couple of more synergistic things along the way, like Seal of Cleansing and Seal of Primordium are in there because there's an Enchantress theme, because there just ends up being a lot of enchantments when you can't play other creatures. So there's a couple of more synergistic versions of those in there, but I feel like it is currently a little bit lacking in the interaction department, and every time I look at an option, I think, well, this also just destroys an Ornithopter.
Yeah, I wonder if there's more just like different Scryfall searches to do. I mean, maybe there's things that destroy things with a higher mana value. So there's some like Despark that can just destroy a big permanent, or lots of things that can just destroy creatures with big power. If you want to say like, it's not going to destroy an Ornithopter on its own, but it'll destroy it once it's suited up.
But I'm more concerned about the non-Ornithopter cards. Like, I want more answers to the non-Ornithopter cards that can never touch an Ornithopter.
Right.
Or that it's really, really inefficient to touch an Ornithopter for whatever reason.
Can I offer you a Bramble Crush? Destroy target non-creature permanent for 2 green.
That is 4 mana.
It is 4 mana for sure. Say what you will about Bramble Crush.
I did that Scryfall search for non-creature destroy exile. I think I did one that was fairly comprehensive, and it was hard to find ones that felt right.
It's funny how this is just like a lot of cards that I don't know, because I guess I just haven't done similar searches. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of space to explore, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's just going to be difficult. I'm
sure I'll discover more problems with it when I play it, but that's what I'm currently feeling. I'm currently feeling like kind of interested in exploring this further. I want to play test it a couple times myself, see how it feels, see if I feel like it has legs. I think the biggest challenges I'm facing right now are, what do I do with the fixing? Because I do want to have a sufficient amount of it for all the reasons I like having a high density of fixing. I could just break Singleton on much more boring lands just to kind of fill it out if I wanted to, but that's definitely a big question mark. And the other big question mark is, what does interaction look like? How do I give people answers to the big swingy stuff that doesn't also just incidentally mean that you get to free roll a bunch of answers to individual Ornithopters? And maybe the answer is just make it more expensive cards, right? Like the 4 mana version.
Bramble Crush.
Bramble Crush feels maybe okay if you're destroying a Forsaken Monument or a Bulbous Citadel, whereas maybe it feels bad to destroy an Ornithopter with it, so you just never get to, you never want to do it.
Target non-creature permanent.
You're right. Okay, so maybe I just
maybe I just need Bramble Crush.
Maybe I just include expensive answers, even if they can hit Ornithopter, because destroying a single Ornithopter with a removal spell will rarely be appealing when you have those things to use on other stuff. So maybe it's not Disenchant and, Naturalize I put in here, but what's the 4 mana exile 2/1 that people play in? Ashes to Ashes? Is that it? What people play in Commander?
Oh, it's got a picture of a sword melting on it.
Sword handle that's like,
there's also Hylian
turning away.
Something or other.
You say melting? It's called something to dust. Turn to dust? Turn to dust?
Turn to dust? Sure.
Turn to dust.
That could be it.
Is that it?
Return to dust. Turn to dust.
Return to dust.
Different card. Why did they do that?
All right, well, because they keep running out of words and magic card names. So maybe it's stuff like that. Maybe the 4 mana answer, you're rarely going to point at an Ornithopter, but you're happy to point at something else. Maybe. Not sure.
Obviously, the best answer that you need to include, and I'm shocked isn't here, is Thopter Arrest.
Is that actually just a pacifism? But
it's just a pacifism, but it's got Thopter in the title, so you have to do it. You have to do it.
Did you just do a Scryfall search for Thopter?
I absolutely did. Of course I did.
But they're ornithopters, not thopters.
But they're a creature type Thopter, so I was seeing what else interacted with Thopters.
Yeah, but thopters to me are 1/1 flyers. These are your O2 flyers.
It is confusing.
If it was called Ornithopter Arrest, sold. I'm putting it in there, but
they're basically synonyms. You have to do it. I would also suggest that if you're going to include one non-Ornithopter creature, it be Retrothopter, which is 1 mana for an O2, so it's worse. So you want those Thopters, but it has 2 mana, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn. And unfortunately, they changed the wording on it, so this isn't super cool in the Turbo Cube, but it can be a 2/2.
Roterothopter, not Retrothopter.
That's exactly what I said.
It's got sick art, too. I really like that old art.
It would be fun just to be like, oh yeah, here's a Model A Thopter that's in here.
Maybe. I'll think about it. To close things out here, we should end with the Pack 1 Pick 1. I'm going to do that, too.
Okay.
Because I think it'll be interesting. Oops. We forgot and did not do this. But I also want to mention the idea I had, which makes this really, really appealing for me to build in paper, which is, obviously I build it in paper. I have to get 100 copies of Ornithopter.
Will you make them all unique Ornithopters?
Well, here's what I'm thinking. I would get the same printing because I love the Antiquities printing, and it's actually getting kind of pricier now, so I'd probably have to get beat up ones to be able to afford to do this, but what I want to do is get, what are they, like $5 or $6 a piece?
$6.50?
Yeah, like that's too much for
you gotta buy them before this
them.
episode comes out.
Yeah, Ornithopter spike incoming. Anyway, maybe it's not that printing. I would get 100 Ornithopters, same printing, and then my thought is, here's my idea, number each of them. So on the card with a Sharpie somewhere consistently, just like number them all 1 to 100, and then on the card keep track of how many times that Thopter kills somebody.
Okay,
with
that's
little check
cool.
marks. So then you're looking through the packs, and it's not just fungible copies of Ornithopter. It's Thopter 37, which has killed people 3 times. It's a scary Thopter as opposed to Ornithopter 12, which has never killed anybody.
I think it would be funny how much. Would there be like biases if people
so
are
much
like,
bias? They would try and kill with the ones that had more kills.
I need to attack with one, or I need to like pick one of these 2 Thopters out of this pack. I'm going to take the better one. Clearly,
they would be taken higher, and also I think they would be like used more regularly to kill people if possible.
It's like if I have the choice, so I'm attacking with one of these, or I'm putting my big equipment on one of these. I'm going to put it on the scarier one.
And then the lore of Thopter 37 just builds.
Yeah, like let people augment them. So it's like, oh, I killed somebody with a grafted war gear, so I'm going to draw what this would look like with a war gear, and then somebody else is like, well, I killed somebody with Eldrazi conscription with Thopter 37, so let's add some tentacles over here.
That's really interesting. Here's what I really like about that idea. I like the idea of the first kill with each Ornithopter gets something, which is a counter motivation to, instead of just say, well, this Ornithopter's already got kills.
Now we're doing design.
Now if you get the first kill with an Ornithopter, you get to do something to it. I don't know what it is.
I feel like it has to be thematic to what it did.
How you killed them?
People would probably do that naturally if you set a light precedent.
Anyway, that idea is kind of what pushed me over the edge of being like, ooh, this could be a really cool 4th cube tone in paper.
I mean, the other option is you just try and get as many of the serialized Ornithopters. There are only 500, so you're going to have to get a good
majority
20% of them.
20% of them.
Yeah, 20%. I did my math right. Scryfall says $300. I have no idea how reliable the pricing is for these. I bet Thopter 69 is way more expensive than
Thopter 69 is going to be really
37.
Expensive. You know, if I were Post Malone, you could convince me to undertake that project, but alas, it's...
If only we had some way that listeners could send in their serialized Ornithopters.
Oh, hey, great. Oh, man, great. Oh. We should have done this at the front of the show. Let's record it now. I'm going to put it at the front of the show, and then we're going to go to the regular conversation.
My segue right to the circular file.
It was... Well, the people are still going to hear a great segue, because I'm going to keep all that, and probably what we're saying right now at the end of the episode, so they'll know that you did a good job, even though it's going to be edited.
13 Ornithopters, put 1 on the stack, then pass the pack. 12 Ornithopters in the cube, 12 Ornithopters in the cube, 12.
And now we're done. We can go outside, Anthony, and enjoy the nice weather. That's it for this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. Thank you all for tuning in. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This podcast is produced by Anthony and I, thinking really hard about magic cards and been speaking to microphones about it. Thanks, buddy. Love making this podcast with you.
I like making this podcast with you.
I said love, you said like, but that's fine. You know, we're not gonna be pedantic about it.
Look, words mean different things to different people. That's
true.
the whole point.
You're not ready to say the L word about making the podcast with me. Not ready for that step. We'll get there someday.
Cube 7 ornithopters. Put one on my stack, then pass the pack. 6 ornithopters in the cube. 6 ornithopters in the cube. 6 ornithopters. Put one on my stack, then pass the pack. 5 ornithopters in the cube. 5 ornithopters in the cube. 5 ornithopters. Put one on my stack, then pass the pack. 4 ornithopters in the cube. 4 ornithopters in the cube. 4 ornithopters. Put one on my stack, then pass the pack. 3 ornithopters in the cube. 3 ornithopters in the cube. 3 ornithopters. Put one on my stack, then pass the pack. 2 ornithopters in the cube. 2 ornithopters in the cube. 2 ornithopters. Put one on my stack, then pass the pack. 1 ornithopter in the cube. 1 ornithopter in the cube. 1 ornithopter. Put one on my stack, then pass the pack. No more ornithopters in the cube.